Welcome everybody to Hudson Presents Conversations with Contemporary Artists. I have one, luckily, right by my side, artist Nikki Lindt. And like I was just explaining to a couple of people, I'm going to do my best to speak a little slowly because there's a tiny bit of lag. So if I forget, somebody can probably remind me if I'm prattling on too loud. So as I'm sure you're aware, this is a program that Michelle Vitale, who's the Cultural Affairs Director at Hudson County Community College, put together. And I've been hosting this program for, I think this is the third semester. And so for the next, roughly an hour, I'm going to be talking with Nikki, and then we'll open up the floor for questions. And I hope that you will have some. So I guess we can start with, you folks taking a peek behind us at some paintings that Nikki is, I didn't even ask you earlier, are these done or are these in process?
They're done, yeah.
So they're finished works behind us. And it looks like maybe in front of us are some studies that you folks can't see. So you would call yourself a painter, right?
Yes.
But you haven't always been, and you also are now sort of branching out into other stuff. Explain for these folks like what your practice encompasses now and how maybe it connects to some of the stuff that you did a really long time ago.
So I would call myself primarily a painter, like first and foremost a painter. But sometimes that medium for me, sometimes it's the perfect medium, and sometimes I need something else to tell a different kind of story. So when I bump into that kind of a situation, then I switch and work with something else. And a little bit of backstory also is, so I decided to go into art when I was quite young, like a teenager, and I really got into painting that time. And I was looking for schools to go to, and I had been born in the Netherlands, come from the Netherlands, and I really wanted to go back there and spend some time there. And there was a school in Amsterdam, and I thought, well, great, there's a school in Amsterdam. I'll go to the school in Amsterdam. And little beknownst to me is that the program was very, very conceptual, and painting was not a very popular thing to do in this program. So that was tough for me.
Yeah,
but then
perfect for a young painter.
Yes, I'm off to Amsterdam. And but it was tough, but what it really did do for me is that it opened me up to looking sort of like, what is the story I want to tell, and what is the best means to get to it. And it didn't in any way change my love for painting. It's still my main medium, but it did open my mind to, if there's a different medium that would work in a certain situation, to go with that.
And I know we've spoken in the past, just so that everybody knows, I think I've known you for over a decade, but not well.
Yeah.
And you said something when we were speaking a couple of weeks ago that you had done, was it puppet shows? Or sort of like theatrical?
Yes.
So but using almost like a proscenium arch?
So no, I had, this is quite a while ago, in the Netherlands, right before I moved back to New York. I directed and produced a small scale opera.
Oh, that's
and it was multimedia, so it was a little bit in that direction as well. And I had made this series of portraits, and they needed more. The portraits needed more, so I created, and the subject of the opera was environmental issues, and I just needed this extra level of storytelling to really bring across what I wanted to do. So I kind of blended the two.
And then, we're talking this is a piece from a really long time ago.
This is a really long time ago.
But cue environmental issues. Michelle sort of, lightly tapped me on the shoulder and she said, do you know any artists whose work, is really about environmental issues? And I was like, oh, Nikki Lindt, like on the nose. And of course, everyone is aware today is Earth Day. And so this artist makes landscapes, is thinking about landscape, but our relationship to the world in a way that not every artist does. I mean, you're really like in it. So as we were talking earlier, you had been making this work for a while, and something kind of turned your mind, and it would really revolved around one term, right?
Yes.
What's the term?
So the term is Solstalgia. I don't know if we want to put on some of those images.
Maybe not yet. I was
Okay.
going to say, I may try to share my screen in a moment to show you folks some images that aren't in the background. But so the term is comes from where?
Yeah, so Solstalgia is a word that's, it's now probably about 10 years old. It's a word that a philosopher in Australia came up with. It's fairly well known now already as a word. And in contrast to nostalgia, which is when you leave a place and you miss it, Solstalgia is when the place leaves you and you have feelings for that. And it's very intertwined with landscapes that maybe get developed that you knew as a child, or different effects that are happening to landscapes around us due to climate change.
So, you've been making this work. You've been, thinking of yourself in a lot of ways as like, responding to, reacting to natural landscape. You stumble upon essentially this philosopher, and like, how did that change your thinking about, essentially you're making the same work, but you're thinking about it in different ways.
I was already making the work. So it was actually a friend of mine who's a science writer, Hubertus, maybe you know, Hubertus Bauer. So I had been talking to him a lot about my work, and I knew that there was something about loss in the work and people's relationships to landscapes. And he came across the term and brought it to my attention. And then I had an exhibit that was called that, and ultimately the philosopher ended up getting in touch with me, and we interacted a bit, which was fantastic. But that's how it came about. I was kind of already working with that series. There was something that I felt, but I wasn't able to express fully in words. And this philosopher had come up with this word that I'm sure not only I was feeling, but many people were and are feeling. So being able to have that word and connect it to that feeling and that work was very powerful for me, because I suddenly understood exactly what it was.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a good time. Might take me a moment here. I'm going to share my screen and show you some of the images. And hopefully everyone can see this pretty well here. I find this kind of scary.
So really the images are people trying to find a connection. These paintings are also, they're quite small and sweet in a way, so there's sort of this contrast to this like sort of heavier feeling of what's in them, but at the same time they have this sort of innocent sweetness because of the size and the colors that that I chose. So that's sort of a balance within them. And some of them are funnier than others.
Yeah, there's something, I mean, like this, the one we're looking at now, it's hard not to think of this as humorous. But at the same time, and I don't know what our audience thinks, they are, I don't know if the right word is going to come to me. They're disturbing because, I mean, there's clearly struggle.
Yeah.
So you were thinking about that, no doubt. Right?
Definitely, like that's intentional. But there's like a sort of trying to find a connection to these places. You know, I live in the city now. When I go, I'm not a super athletic person. When I go, you know, take my hike in the woods, I'm struggling just on that little path or whatever. And it's sort of like trying to find that connection. That's really what that series was about.
And the title of the series is Displace.
It's divided into two parts. It was a long series over several years. And the first half was Solstalgia, and the second half was Displace.
Okay. Yeah. These works, and I'll go back to the first one real quick. These pieces are culled from photographs, correct?
It's a mix. There's sketches, there's photographs, there's imagination. So it's really, it's a mix of all of those things.
Oh, okay.
I definitely go off also in my own memories, or I change the works as I'm working on them.
Okay. Because I think when I first saw these, I sort of assumed that they were sort of like the Robert Longo Men in the Cities series. And he had, you know, his friends and acquaintances, you know, strike poses, and then they were all basically, you know, done from the photos. So I assumed that they were like friends, perhaps you, like literally going on camping trips and doing things and being
that's
photographed.
definitely a part of it. So that's yeah.
There's probably not a soul out here tonight in the Zoom grid that hasn't had a nice vacation someplace where they felt like this, you know, the environment became sort of like scenery, was, you know, just a beautiful thing. You have, you know, growing up for, you know, and now of course too, this is definitely a big part of your life. Like you like to get out into nature.
I do.
Was that always a thing? And was getting out into nature as a kid like very informative for how you would later sort of set up the goal for your art?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I grew up definitely like the trips that we took as a family were we went out into nature. We went backpacking into the Rockies when we were really tiny. I can't believe my parents had the guts to do that. My really very young years were in the Netherlands, where trees, even sometimes in forests, are planted in rows. So that's like a very different kind
Well,
of.
just the idea that you just said like they're planted.
Yes.
Like they.
Yes, exactly.
They weren't just there.
Yeah, I mean, I would like, when I live in Holland, I'd look at the sky for that feeling of freedom and like the beautiful big clouds. And it's like definitely nature's a little bit different there. And then when we moved to the States, we moved to rural Pennsylvania. And that was a complete contrast. And I love that. Like I spent the second half of my childhood, like, you know, in the woods, and really felt very connected to those places. And a lot of those places have been developed now, like the fields we used to go to or areas we used to go to. And that would be then that feeling of solstalgia, where like something that I remember and go back to isn't there anymore.
Right. I almost forget, when I share my screen, I think everyone only sees this. Let me, as long as we're doing that, tell me about that image. Okay,
so this, so I'm going to just make a little bridge between the two series. So when I was working with that series, I felt like, okay, I'm working, you know, with this sort of this grief about the change of our environment. But I started to feel like I'm a little bit going in circles here. Like, yes, of course, it's a worthy subject to work with, but I felt like there was more or something else that I needed to understand or wrap my head around. And I was reading these articles about permafrost thaw in the Arctic, and that there were roads that had collapsed and villages and people had to move. And suddenly I started to think like, okay, I'm hearing about the roads and the villages, but what is happening to this immense, beautiful landscape? This can't only be happening under the roads or under the villages. So I started to research more, and this was really like a really pivotal moment for me, because I reached out to scientists to see if maybe I could tag along and learn a little bit. And secretly with the agenda to ask them what is going on,
Right.
because we're all really confused and we want to understand more. And so I found a group of scientists that were willing, thankfully to them, to work with an artist.
I mean, as you were writing this email, were you just laughing to yourself?
I was like, yes,
you're
they're
never going to get that.
Well, the funny thing is I wrote like 5 or 6 places, and there was the one, but it was also like really like one that they do some really incredible serious work. They were the ones that wrote me back, and I was like, wow, I can't believe it. So they took me out and they taught me how to sort of read and understand what was happening, like how you could look at the surface of the land and see what was happening underneath. Right. With the permafrost thaw. So they taught this to me, and luckily my husband agreed to come along as my field partner. They were like, okay, now you know, now you can go explore. And this is the Dalton Highway. It's probably one of the most, how shall I put it? They call it dangerous. I don't know if that would be the right word, but it's the road that some moments needs some work. And there's really nobody there. I mean, you drive and drive and drive. I think there's like a population of like 37 people along the way. And so we drove up into the tundra and went, you know, I learned sort of how to go into it and find what I was looking for. And it was just absolutely crazy what I saw. And there were some articles that had been written by some scientists, but they weren't like going and taking pictures, and they were describing it more scientifically. Sure. But there were these like huge, like football field sized, look like sinkholes or craters. They call them thermokarst failures. And those are areas of collapsed permafrost thaw, and there's trees that are growing horizontally, sideways, at every angle you can imagine, and it's all over the Arctic.
Right. I guess we'll look at an image of trees growing sideways.
Yeah, this is what scientists call a drunken forest, for obvious reasons. Yeah, and the trees, you know, the ground underneath them destabilizes, so this is what they grow like now, and that's the rest of their life. They're not gonna shift back up. That's like what this forest looks like now. Yeah, it was pretty terrifying. And then I know when we were talking about this earlier, I was telling you that there was this sort of duality in being in these places, because the growing season in Alaska is really short. So
I'll stop sharing for just a moment.
Okay. The growing season in Alaska is really, really short. So it's like everything just grows like crazy. It's like this super vitality and all of that. So there was this contrast of, you know, where I was seeing our fingerprint of how we were affecting these places and sort of the damage that was being caused, and at the same time this life force that was so intense, and those two exact feelings, which were both so strong. It was really interesting to yeah, it was just very moving to encounter that at once.
So you wrote to these scientists, you were overjoyed, and they wrote back and said, hey, come on up. You came on up. You walked around, you looked at stuff. And then did you think immediately, now I know what to do, painting wise? Or did you think like, I want to do this just for me? And the paintings will do what they're going to do.
Well, I brought a lot of things with me. I brought my camera, which I used a lot. I brought sketchbooks and I wrote a lot. Also I brought like ones where I wrote more sort of what I was seeing in a more factual way, and then sort of more like also in a diary kind of way, because I was processing so many feelings when I was seeing this and so many thoughts. I was sketching, and I also brought a sound recorder with me to record the sounds that I was hearing, which I brought for one purpose, and it ended up launching me into this whole other body of work that I'm working on now. There, when I was hearing these like sounds coming out of these deep like sinkhole like craters.
Sounds crazy.
Yeah, it really was. Yeah.
So we might be skipping maybe too far ahead, but we can always circle back. Tell me a little bit about what you're doing now for the, with the sound work, but also just in collaboration with other people.
Okay. So it's this experience working with the scientists up there, it really made me realize how important collaboration was. Like sort of, I felt like I'd been moving at a certain pace with my thinking and my understanding of what was going on, like, 1 mile per hour. And suddenly my whole thinking about and understanding what I was seeing and what, how I could conceptualize these things within work, like through the collaborative process, I was learning so much that it really moved me forward. And I would say also, as difficult as this work was, or these areas were to see, like I would say, like in a very kind of hot, like I was seeing more difficult things, but in a way I was feeling more hopeful in a certain kind of way, just by interacting with people, understanding things better, and feeling like I was interacting with that subject. So I started recording those sounds there, and I got really interested in the sounds that I was hearing inside of these, they're called thermokarst failures, but those huge sinkholes. And I had a residency shortly after I came back from my second trip to Alaska, in a forest in New Hampshire. And I continued during that residency. I was like, okay, I'm going to focus on the sound stuff for a while because it's so weird and so interesting. So I did more there and started to like really discover that. And also just back in New York State, I did more of it as well. And I started to like really discover that there was just this whole hidden world of sound inside trees and in the soil and in streams. And I was kind of using microphones in very non-conventional ways because there aren't really microphones built for that. And it just started to, I didn't purposely set out to do this. It kind of took me. And then one thing led to another. And now this past year, I was part of a residency for New York City called the Urban Field Station Collaborative Arts Program, where I interact with the city and I have access to collaborate with everybody. So there's like scientists and social scientists, and I mean, it's endless. So I learned so much and was able to explore. I mean, there's more than 10,000 acres of natural areas in New York City, which I feel like we forget. It took me a long time to even realize they were here, but there's like beautiful, beautiful areas So I started to record in all of these, make these recordings paired with videos, and also sort of the human impact on these areas. And then I was telling you earlier that I have a little piece of property about 4 hours north of New York City. And so I was recording there as well. So it's sort of like these.
And when you say recording, are you just dropping microphones down holes?
I'm digging a hole and putting a microphone in.
Okay.
In the meantime, I've collected a couple different kinds of microphones that I'll use different. I've become handier and handier with it. So there's different kinds of microphones work for some of these different places to record in. Yeah, so that's and that's culminating in May in a sound walk in Prospect Park. Yeah.
So write that down, kids. One more time.
It's so on May 14th, you're all invited to this project. It's opening in Prospect Park. It will be up for a year, and it's called the Underground Sound Project. So you can find it that way as well.
Very cool. You're obviously documenting in a lot of ways. Have you been consciously thinking about, what you're getting out of the work, what you're hoping that the work sort of radiates out itself as a form of, I don't know how to say this, is, as something that's just maybe adjacent, but certainly different from mere documentation?
Absolutely. I mean, it's sort of like this whole conversation that we started with Solstalgia, and like feeling like that something is moving away from me. I feel like definitely with the sound project right now, I feel like it's like I'm finding a connection to something rather than feeling like it's dripping between my fingers. I feel like it's like if I'm hanging out with a friend and there's something I don't know about them, I learn something new and I feel closer, and it gives me that feeling of coming closer to something. So I feel like that this project has done that for me, and I hope that it also does it for people who come to see the project, where you can hear like, wow, oh, I didn't know that about a tree. Like when the wind blows, it sounds like there's music inside. It sounds like there's a Gregorian chant inside the tree. Or, like in the stream, there's all this beautiful melodic sound that you don't hear above water, but you do hear it underwater. So there's and same with in the soils, there's just this like incredible world. And it made me feel like, wow, I'm really like coming to it. I'm coming towards it. I'm connecting with nature. And I mean, I just think that's so important right now, because I feel like for me, and I feel like for a lot of people, there's this feeling of things slipping away. And this is like really made me feel great, feeling like I can connect with it in this way.
Yeah. I mean, I think, without sounding too corny, that's a huge thing for all artists, that, there is a field called art therapy, but all artists self-therapize. Is that?
Oh, for sure.
I'm not sure if that's a real
sure.
verb, but that is a component that we often don't talk about when artists get together. It's so obvious. That's why you make work. It's to feel something that's bigger than yourself. And as we're looking around at paintings, both small, large, this one behind me is a work on, this is paper.
This
correct?
one's on paper. Yeah.
And it's acrylic and ink. Maybe I'll try to get out of the way a little bit. But you're definitely responding to obviously specific landscapes, but they're containers for so much more than just nostalgia. We spoke earlier about this idea of like hopefulness. What am I trying to say? Did you have to sort of make a conscious effort to, when you were seeing these massive sinkholes, was it just like, oh no, this is terrible? Did you have to think like, okay, I have to figure out a way to
No,
not,
no.
it just
yeah.
happened?
No, it's when I was there, it was like, it was so incredibly beautiful there.
Yeah.
And like I was saying before, there's like this life force that's like, it's right there, you
Yeah.
know? And it's like, if we work together with it, it's right there. And I mean, I think, I personally think that, you know, I mean, the news is very difficult these days, but I think there's so much like potential positive abilities in humans too. And it's sort of like, you know, in a way, we're lucky that there's something that we can do. We could also be in a situation where it'd be like, there's absolutely nothing we can do.
Right.
But there are things that we can do. So, you know, it's definitely, we're teetering at a difficult moment, but it doesn't mean that, that it's not still, the things can't still.
Part of caring is like connecting.
That's exactly it. Yeah. And that again, through talking with various people, especially here in New York City, I also, that was something that I started to really realize, that me connecting, and then also through, you know, me sort of like having that connection and showing the work that was made as a result of that connection, if that can help people connect themselves, then that's a really, that's an important force, the force of connection.
Yeah, well, speaking of connecting, I'm going to share the screen one more time, and we will connect with some more of these images. So we have I love that, it's a beautiful term, Drunken Forest. This is
This is one of those
failure.
thermokarst, it's definitely a failure. Thermokarst failures, yeah. And those are adult-sized pines. They're not like, I mean, it sounds hard to tell from a photo. The photos
Right.
are definitely it's so grand, these things, when you're there.
Yeah, and for those of you who may not know, an adult-sized pine, we're talking like 50, 60 feet.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes. Yeah.
And there's, you know, telltale
travel sketches.
Travel sketches.
Yeah.
This is beautiful. I mean, you're definitely trying to get some indication of local color.
Yes.
But then there's, you know, for lack of a better word, it feels like the mark making and the attention to a certain kind of palette almost makes me think of what you were mentioning, like the vitality.
Yeah.
Sort of like, you know,
Yes.
these are,
And
they seem very animated.
The forces also,
Yeah.
like I was very busy with, like, because I had learned about how those forces were working underground. So the mark making definitely alludes to that. And this one also has a lot of those vertical lines, with which there were many things I was thinking with that. There was the forces, the greenhouse gases, and then also like the scientists with their, like, they were constantly flagging things, flagging everything. It's always these like these vertical sticks they stick in everything, and that really stuck out to me too. So that's sort of in there too.
Yeah. And these are things that you do on the spot, obviously.
Yeah. And sometimes I go back into them a little bit still. But it's like, it's a way of processing. These are still this, I think one more is a sketch. Yeah. And then I took the sketches, and if we move to the next one, when I came back, like I had this one's also quite large. This is like, I think 8 foot by 4 foot. And I had the sketches and the memories and the photos and the diary. And then I was back in my studio and I wasn't there anymore. And that's sort of when the painting started. You know, that's when I was able to process and distill some of the thoughts and ideas. And you know, because when you're on the spot, when you're on site, it's so overwhelming, and it's just sort of like collecting everything, and there's no way I could distill it at that moment. But then I came back here, I was in New York City, which is, I mean, that couldn't be more different than the Arctic Circle. But then I was back in my studio, and I was able to start processing the thoughts, and that's when the painting process started for me.
And obviously, like, you know, there's a major scale shift. Why so large?
Because everything felt so large there.
Yeah.
And that was like a shift for me, because the series before this that we were looking at, Solstalgia, those were little paintings. And I was like, I can't do this little. There's no way I can do this little. So I started, I mean, this was for me a huge change of scale. But it felt like that's what I had to do for that series.
And these images are all fairly, you know, large works, right?
Yes. Yeah. And they're ink and acrylic paint.
And the ones that I'm seeing in the studio, some are on paper. There's one, or I guess there's 2 or 3 on canvas. I think most people would just assume, like, well, you know, the materials respond differently.
Yes.
Is part of the, I mean, you can get very large sheets of paper, you know, on rolled paper. Is the paper largely because of scale, or is it because of the way it reacts to ink and watercolor?
It started out as a kind of like, okay, I need to move through these ideas. So paper seems like a really good way to do it. But then I just completely fell in love with how the paper was reacting with the ink, which is, you know, when I switched to canvas, there's a whole other process of how that reacted. And that's been interesting for me too. But the paper was, because there was this, you know, contrast between this, like, it's sort of this duality. I felt like I could come back to the duality in the materials, because on paper you get really this really glowing, translucent feeling with the watercolors, and then I layered it with acrylic. And on the canvas, that worked a little differently. So I started heading in some other directions with the canvas. But when I first came back, that felt very, very important.
I feel like I've lost my place here. Maybe not.
This one has kind of like this spinning kind of dizziness in it. When you're in some of those forests where those pine trees are just, these were all smaller pine trees. And they were all just like, kind of, yeah, it looked like a drunken forest. That term is really accurate. It's the tree. I didn't know whether it was me, you know, that would be drunk, or whether the trees were drunk, but it felt like, it didn't feel like a normal forest. That's for sure.
That's quite surreal.
Very, very, yeah.
And that's something I thought about when I was writing the copy for my, e-blast to alert people to our talk. But the way that you're painting doesn't seem like it has, much to do with surrealism, like the historical movement. But, your subject is very surreal.
Yeah.
Because it's something that exists that so many people don't see. Even if it's in the case of New York City, I mean, it really is all around us, but like we're not always primed to see what's really happening. I mean, do you feel like mean, I think I know the answer to this, but I'm gonna ask you anyway. Do you feel like working on this, you see, good old New York that you call this place home for a long time. Do you walk down the street and like see things differently?
Oh, completely, completely. With each of these projects. And, now with the sound, I'm really excited to, because I've taken a little bit of a break from painting, and I can't wait to go back to the painting with all of the knowledge that I have now about the sound and see how that affects the paintings too. So it's sort of like this building, I feel like I'm building up a relationship with these locations.
That's interesting. It makes me want to have a breakout moment myself as an artist. I just want everyone to see some more of these images, so I'll roll through.
That's the one behind us.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
It is interesting. I mean, I think everyone knows that it can be so odd to see something on a screen, and then when you see it in real life, it's like, oh, very different.
It's not 5 inches.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the color in these is really quite beautiful.
Yeah, and a lot of the color that are in these, it's the art looks so subtle in a way when you're there, but when you look closer and you look like at the stems of the grasses or in the trees, there's so much color there. So that it wasn't hard for me to, sometimes I push colors, like here obviously that red is pushed for where the ground is ripped, because that's what this is an image of. And I was more thinking about the depths of earth in this image, so I take it like that's what I was saying before, is like I work with sketches and photos and memories, or also just my own imagination of what I want to portray. But a lot of those colors, like in the grasses, that's like I carried a lot of those colors back with me that were actually there.
It's like, I mean, it's like seeing it on a very small scale and purposefully like building it up like at a larger scale, which again, it seems like a classic maneuver in like the way a lot of artists work. The part serving for the whole, a small area for something larger. I'm gonna do that so that we're back in the studio. And my little chimes just chimed, which means I'd like to open up the room, and we've got a few people here now, which is great. Questions for Nikki? Fire away.
I have a question. So
Absolutely.
I really love how you paint, and I feel like it evokes a lot of motion in the work. Like the landscapes don't feel still, even though that's a typical feeling of a landscape is the stillness. And I want to talk, I would love for you, I don't want you to share all your secrets because I know those are special, but I would love and we need to get her in the, maybe you can turn your computer, Michael, a little bit. Yeah, there we go. Special lady of the evening, we need to see her. I also, I would love for you to talk about how you create movement in your work.
Yeah, echo is pretty strong.
We're just trying to deal with the echo, folks.
Yeah, I got that.
I'll ignore it. So gesture has always been important to me in my work. So that's, I think, part of how the movement comes into the pieces.
Interesting.
Yeah, so the movement that comes into the work, like definitely, I think a lot about gesture and movement while I'm working. So I think that it kind of naturally integrates because the mark making, I use that to work with the movement.
Interesting. That's so, I love that. I just feel, I really feel it. I also think your color choices also echo, like, just even the shadows. They're not, I don't know, I just love it. Okay, I'm gonna be quiet. Next.
Uh, Anybody else have a question for Nikki?
Yeah,
I
I
do. Oh,
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 whoever was that gonna go first?
you go for it, Soma.
Okay. I was gonna ask how you came about to developing your specific style because I took a look at your paintings before the talk started, and I noticed that you just have like a very specific style that's like kind of recognizable. Like if I would see a painting, I could immediately tell that it was by you. So that was just like my first question, how you like settled onto that being your style. And the second question was if you have any influences or any like other artists that inspire you.
Okay. So I would say that the style that developed over time. I mean, there's definitely things that are important to me. Like uh, color is very important to me, and I guess over time there's a certain way that I've grown to using it. I like to use some pure color or close to pure color. There's different things that slowly I've discovered I appeal to me and that I like and that function for my work. So slowly those, I guess over time, if I think about the trajectory, like slowly that molded itself and developed into the way that I work now. And the word that I mentioned before, gesture, that's always been really important to me to sort of talk about things slightly in movement. That's always been important. So yeah. And then in terms of inspirations, lately a lot of my inspirations are not necessarily artists or scientists in the Arctic that were very inspiring to me. The philosopher that I talked about earlier. In terms of painting, I would say I like Peter Doig, Lewis Dodd. Mary Mattingly is another name that comes to mind. That's an artist that works with ecological issues in the city right now, here in New York City. Her work is really interesting. I mean, there's a lot of, there's a lot of people, a lot of inspiring people out there.
Yeah. Well, and as I look at it, the grid, and I'm thinking of, Eric Graham, Josh Marsh, there are other people I'm trying to think. Those are the ones that come to mind. I mean, they've worked with landscape, but in such different ways. It's a pretty wonderful container for like all kinds of ideas.
I totally agree. I mean, there's so many, I mean, it's something that's a part of, it's something we have in common,
Yeah,
and we all have
sure.
that in common. And there's, depending on how you approach it, it will tell a different story. Yeah.
More questions, folks?
I guess I have a little bit of a comment / question. I was going to turn on my video, but I can't turn on my video. So Nikki, I'll just shoot the question out. I guess I literally just listened to an episode of Hidden Brain podcast. I don't know if you ever listened to that.
Good one.
But they had an episode, I believe it was called Cassandra's Curse. And it was talking about like why people, why they heed certain warnings and why they choose to ignore others. And part of the episode was on the melting or the defrosting permafrost. And I guess I'm wondering, how much do you want your paintings and your sound installations to be about just looking at the landscape, or are they a warning in a sense to the viewer? I mean, do you see them as like a warning or like a call to action? And then just I had a comment too about the mark making that you were talking about, is that, you know, I've always loved how loose your mark making is, and a lot of your paintings feel like the figure, when you include a figure, it's very, very like detail, not necessarily detailed, but it's more developed than say the landscape. The landscape sometimes feels like shorthand for the landscape, or the marks are very gestural. And in a sense, when I look at these paintings and think about what you're talking about, it almost feels like it's like the movement and the activity of all of this, like when I think about the permafrost, you know, as it thaws out, it's like all of this decay that's happening and this energy that's being released, and, you know, the carbon dioxide that's being released. And I definitely get the feeling from that when I'm looking at these paintings. But I guess I just was curious as to like, what role, you know, do you want us to just come to these as, you know, a pure landscape, or is there a bit of a warning with the paintings?
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, definitely, like there is a warning aspect. And a lot of times when I show the paintings, the way I've exhibited them, I've also played the recording of the thawing permafrost, which is like, it's actually kind of like, the sounds are kind of meditative, which sounds weird in a way, but it's like, it's relentless because it doesn't stop, which is, I think, what makes it, that's like the part of it. It's like that mix again.
That's a show title, Relentless.
It's relentless. It just doesn't stop. So, you know, it's like, so that I combine that with the paintings and the story also of being there. And sometimes when I've exhibited the work, I also have displayed the diary that I had while being there. And the project that's opening in May, with the sound work and video component, has a more direct call to action in it, where I give a voice. One of the stops along the sound walk is I give a voice to these natural elements and what they might say. So yes, that's in there. Sometimes more subtle and sometimes less subtle. And, you know, sometimes the paintings are truthfully like me working out the ideas for myself. And then when people look at them, it's sort of like seeing through my eyes how I experienced the situation.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, good question.
Yeah.
You've done this before, Lauren.
I have a question from Allison Jarvis. Her speaker isn't working. She says, have you or will you be writing about your whole permafrost experience? Do you understand what I'm saying?
I did, actually. There's an article that I was asked to write by Artists in Climate Change, which is a really, really interesting publication, online publication. And they asked me to write an article on the whole story and experience of this trip to the Arctic. So that exists, yes. Thank you.
And how does someone access that? I mean, is it something that you can purchase, or do you just go online to see it?
It's an online publication. So
and it's literally called Artists.
It's called Artists and Climate Change.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Did you ever think, 15 years ago, that you would be doing what you're doing now?
No. I mean, yes, the climate change. I mean, these issues have like that. It's been a part of me for off and on. I mean, the last 15 years, not off and on, it's been constant, but as a teenager, I made some paintings that were connected to this, and it just kind of went off and on for a while. And then, so I'm not shocked with the subject matter at all, but the forms everything is taking keeps surprising me. Like 2 years ago, I would be very surprised to hear what I'm doing now. So it's sort of like the flow of life is just sort of somehow, you know, a part of the process too.
Yeah. Glasses back on here. Thank you, by the way, Allison, for your question. Do we have any other questions by way of, you know, the chat, or Min, go ahead.
Yeah. Yes. Hello, Nikki. This may be a generic, but yeah, I have a curiosity for a question. What kind of like paint do you use, and like how do you like retain like the these colors without, you know, having to like your paint like almost like blend in with like everything else? Because the way that I see it, it almost like everything here looks a bit, every like little bit of paint here, every little detail looks more noticeable, but it's not like, like blending in with like everything else. So I was a little curious about that, because like that's something that's really cool, and well, like I'm a fan of it already.
Thank you. That's a really good question. So well, I'll start with the beginning of your question, which is I use acrylic paint. I use Golden, brand Golden, and I use a variety of brands of watercolor. It just depends on when I find shades of, I mean, ultramarine blue is going to be different with every brand. So when I find one that I really like, then, so that kind of varies. But I mix those two things up. I definitely work with blending. And I would say that's earlier in my process, especially if I'm starting with very sort of thinner layers. Then I work with a lot of water, and they naturally blend. And then, I mean, this is not always I'm sort of abstracting my process right now, but then later on, I'm a little bit more direct with my color later on, and then I get those very distinct colors. So that's sort of my process in a nutshell.
Yeah, I mean, they really do retain a freshness and brightness that you know, she makes it look easy, folks. It's not the easiest thing to, like, you know, keep a painting from being muddy, right? But you've been at this for literally decades now.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah. Min, thank you very much for your question. We are almost at a point where we need to let you guys do your other Friday night routines, but maybe one more question, and then we'll have to say goodbye. Patricia, go ahead.
Good evening. First off, I wanted to say that I really like your work. I'm on your website right now, and I've just been staring at it for like the last hour. I just wanted to ask, like, from your perspective, since you've worked with, like, you know, Alaskan scientists, and you've had this amazing perspective on our environment that not a lot of people have, is it's hard to stay like environmentally conscious, and for me personally, and to not succumb to like the doom and gloom mindset that, like, you know, the world's gonna end because of global warming. So I just wanted to know, like, how would you like maintain that hope that things can still change for the better, I guess.
I'm having a little bit trouble hearing the question.
So
Let me-
I heard it.
Okay.
I'll repeat it. She basically asked what we were talking about in the beginning about how do you keep a positive attitude about the climate when there's so much doom and gloom.
Yeah, I'm of course also sensitive to, the difficulties right now and the lack of political will right now on these days on these issues. So of course that affects me too. But I would say that a really key thing for me has been collaboration and working with other people. And first of all, it makes, like as an artist, we were talking about this earlier, it's like you spent a lot of time alone in your studio. And that coupled with, that was a lot for me. But when working in collaboration, first of all, I feel like I understand things a little bit better, which has given me some strength to see that there's, also a lot of people out there that are trying to find solutions. There's tons of scientists out there studying things, and they are moving, it's like a moving force that's moving in a certain direction, and it's not just the scientists. I'm working with some schools for the projects that I'm doing right now, and it's just amazing, these like really green teams in these high schools, and the kids.
And these are, I'm sorry, these are Brooklyn high
These are
schools?
high schools in Brooklyn, and it's like there's these kids that are just, they are spending their time outside of school, working together and trying to push, certain things forward within their community. And it's sort of, it's like a shift of thinking. And I feel like, it takes a long time for a ship to turn around. And I think we're in that process, and I am hopeful about the future. There's a lot to overcome, but I also think, that once the sort of the will to work with these changes, that people are, that are also a powerful and potentially positive force.
The way you say that makes me believe you. Thank you very much, Patricia. Thank you to everyone. I don't know what screen I should be looking at. Maybe my own.
Camera one.
Everyone who came tonight, thank you very much for taking the time to come to our little Zoom. Artist Nikki Lindt, and your website is what? nlindt?
nlindt.com.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then just real quick, the upcoming thing, May 14th.
It's opening May 14th. It's in Prospect Park. Bring your headphones, and you can.
Good.
Very
pro
important.
tip.
Yes,
Okay.
Bring your headphones and your phone. You'll be able to. It's an interactive. Trees sound like, what the soil sounds like underground, what streams sound like, and you will be very surprised. It's very dramatic.
Very cool. So folks, have a wonderful weekend. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Summer, for doing some upcoming editing. And then, as always, at the end of our semester, which is coming up pretty fast, Summer should have something edited and maybe available to be seen again by your loved ones on YouTube. But until our next May talk, I bid you a good weekend, and thank you very much, Nikki, for doing this. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.